Hello and welcome to episode 9 of my baseball interview series. I'm Jeremy Frank, joined by Sarah Langs. Sarah, thank you for joining me. Hope you're doing all right.
Yeah, thank you so much for having me. Hope you're doing right as well.
So to get started, for people who don't know who you are, how would you describe yourself in a few sentences, what you do for a job, stuff like that?
Sure. So, I think I would say I'm a baseball researcher professionally, which is a pretty fun thing to be able to say. I worked at ESPN for a few years, and now I work for Major League Baseball. I'm a reporter and researcher would technically be my position, but basically I just want to, share my love of the game with everybody and, maybe teach them something they didn't know beforehand.
So with the coronavirus, obviously, there's been quite the disruption in not just our everyday lives, but sports specifically, which is what you do for a living. So what have you been doing with your extra time now that obviously there was no baseball going on before March until spring training, but now there's no baseball going on at all. So what have you been doing since this has all started?
Yeah, I think it's, really been a good opportunity for people to get really creative. I'm still working 5 days a week and, most of the people who I know who work in sports, whether it's in baseball or other sports, are still working, which is a good thing and I hope continues. And it just means that we sort of have to come up with different things, a lot more historical look backs. I feel like a lot of people have been watching old games. That's something I've really gotten into that I wasn't really into beforehand. I could probably count on like one hand the number of games I'd watched, like
Yeah,
old games previously, before the last maybe week and a half or 2 weeks. And now
right.
like I've watched one almost every day. So I think it's just the creativity. I think baseball is so great for that, because there's so much history and more so than other sports, if you ask me. And obviously, I'm biased in that way. So I feel like there's so much for us to dig through.
Yeah, no, I totally agree. If you wanted to find stuff there's so many things that you can find that only a few people know about. Even going back just a few decades, a lot of people, there are things you can uncover that will be interesting to people nowadays with no baseball going on. Obviously, we would rather have baseball, but it is a great sport for historically to find interesting things about. But when the coronavirus, when there's no global pandemic, when you're at work, what does your typical day at the job look like?
So the really cool thing about what I do is that there's literally no typical day. Every day is different and, just it's very much dependent on what happens in baseball. And sometimes I'll work during the daytime, so maybe there won't be games going on, but then I'll come home and watch every game that happens that night anyway. And sometimes I'll be working at night while all of the games are going on. So if I'm working at night during that time, my biggest thing I'll be focusing on is just, what storylines are going on? How can I help our reporters? How can I help anybody else who might have a question as things are going on? And also keep an eye on storylines I'm tracking myself. I'll write a lot of stories that are research based and StatCast based. So anything that I see starting to develop, oh, this could be a good idea. Maybe I want to write this about Josh Bell, keeping an eye on those things as they develop. But I'm totally at the mercy of what happens in the sport, which is so much fun.
So correct me if I'm wrong, but most of your work is either writing or researching. So between those two things, which do you enjoy? Like, are you more of a creative writing person, or do you enjoy looking up the numbers more?
Um, I don't know. That's a tough one. I growing up, I always wanted to be a baseball reporter in some way. Starting in like sixth grade. So the writing has definitely been a key part of who I've been for a very long time now. But I just love getting lost in like a player's baseball reference page or StatCast page, discovering something new. And, that's why it's so cool that I get to do both of those things at once in my job. But I don't know if I could pick one. It's so intertwined for me, but definitely just talking about baseball and approaching it and analyzing it is the best part.
So that was kind of my follow-up question was what did you want to do when you were a kid, like when you were an adult, if that makes sense. But you kind of did answer that. But I'm sure when you were growing up, it was very hard for women to get into sports, especially in a sports writing or even what you do now. So what would you say to another woman who is looking to get into sports, who thinks it may be more of a long shot? What would you say to them?
Yeah, I would just say not to think about that at all. We put together our MLB Cut 4, put together a great video on, I guess it was International Women's Day or Women in Sports Day. Sorry, there have been a couple of those lately. I
Yeah.
don't which one. But they put together a video where they talked to a bunch of women who work at Major League Baseball and asked them questions like that. And I remember exactly what I said, which was that if someone gives you the impression that you can't do this, they're just wrong, because it really doesn't matter. I mean, what matters is believing in yourself and believing in your own abilities and knowing what you know, and I've always been really lucky, I guess, as I've gone through this, because knowing a lot about baseball is kind of my bread and butter, right? So I never feel badly if someone were to imply that I don't know enough. And honestly, I've never had interactions like that. But regardless of whether you're in that spot or not, I just think that, don't let other people get to you. And that goes across the board. That goes for anybody, who's looking into honestly any job, but especially sports, because it can be so competitive and there's, such a saturated landscape. So you just have to believe in what you're doing.
And I think sports and baseball specifically has come a long way in the last decade. I think it would have been a lot harder 10 years ago for someone like a woman to do what you do now. I think it's been a lot more normalized, which is terrific. If you look at who works for MLB, I don't know everyone who works there, but I don't think it's quite 50-50 between like men and women, but I think it's getting a lot closer than it was 10, 20 years ago, or even just 5 years ago. I think that the sport has come a long way.
Yeah. And I just think the most important thing is that I have never been made to feel that anyone doubted me because of my gender or anything at any point. And I've been so lucky with the people I've interacted with. And like, that's always what I mention to people. If people ask me that kind of question, is that, even the breakdown, the percentage doesn't exactly matter as long as everybody is being kind to each other and not being judgmental for very silly reasons. So
yeah, no, I totally agree. So in 5 years, if you had to guess what you would be doing in 5 years, whether that would be in the same role you are now or doing something differently, like where do you see yourself and what do you want to be doing in 5 years?
I want to be doing what I'm doing now. I certainly want more and more opportunities, and I'm always working to get those. But I really loved, this past year was my first year working for MLB.com, and I got the chance to go on MLB Network a bunch. I got to go on the DAZN show that they have going on at night when there are games, and just talking to people about baseball, going on podcasts, going on TV, writing about it, all of that. That's what I love doing. So I hope I'm going to be doing that, for a long time.
Yeah, your job sounds very up my alley as well. But like for your job for MLB, do you go to a lot of games in person, or do you more like sit back and watch a lot of games at the same time and try and find some things for those games, or a little bit of both?
Yeah, it's honestly both. Last year I had the opportunity to cover a handful of games, either for visiting reporters who didn't make certain trips, or, when our Yankees and Mets reporters, Brian Hoke and Anthony DiComo, had days off. So that was really good, and it was really good experience to be in the clubhouse and in the press box. And when I didn't have those specific game coverage trips, I would still kind of try to make it, whatever split I could. I love being at the ballpark, but I also love having my, set up where I've got every single game up at once and I can be keeping track of every single thing going on. So I just try to strike a balance.
Yeah. So is your current job for MLB, is it based in New York City?
Yeah.
Okay. Did you grow up in New York, or did you grow up somewhere else?
Yeah, I grew up in New York, and then I went to school in Chicago. So
okay. Where'd you go to school in Chicago?
University of Chicago.
Okay. I have a few friends that go there now. But so growing up, you grew up in New York. Were you a big Yankees fan, a big Mets fan, or neither?
I grew up a Mets fan. Yeah.
Okay.
My parents raised me that. My mother's a Giants fan, and my dad was a Pirates fan growing up. But then when he moved to the city for medical school and everything else, he ended up being a Mets fan. So we went to a lot of Mets games growing up. We went to some Yankees games, but a lot more Mets games.
Do you still find yourself rooting for the Mets? Obviously, you don't do I've talked to a few people who do like commentary who really have to separate themselves from rooting for a team. But I feel like for your job, it's probably less important to not have a team to root for. But do you still find yourself cheering for the Mets more than you would for other teams, or is it just you like baseball, you wanna?
I don't really cheer. With what my job is now, I really can't. And I wouldn't want to. But honestly, I was working in a different role before this one where it wouldn't have mattered. And I found myself, the more I was working in baseball, the less I was caring specifically from a rooting interest standpoint. I certainly root for storylines and for individual players, but my mother will point it out all the time when I have something positive to say about maybe a team that she's not a fan of, because she's still a fan, and my dad will do the same. But that comes up every now and then. But I don't really root anymore at all.
Gotcha. Yeah, I think a lot of people would say the same thing as you. They root for players and for storylines. But growing up, so were your parents the reason that you became a big baseball fan, or was it something else?
Yeah, no, definitely it was my parents. My parents are huge sports fans, and my mom is a really big sports fan, and my dad is too. But I think that a lot of little girls growing up don't necessarily have both of their parents so into sports. Well, my parents were pretty much equal in that respect, and so it was just what we watched. You know, growing up, I was watching SportsCenter and Baseball Tonight and NFL Primetime and everything else, and that's just what I watched. I didn't really watch TV, so that's why. And you know, it was just never something that I wasn't supposed to be interested in.
Right. Did you play baseball or softball as a kid?
I played softball in like middle school and high school for a little bit, but I was really bad. And I still think it's funny because I know exactly how it's supposed to work. And so I feel like I should be better, but I'm not coordinated enough.
Yeah. So other than baseball, obviously you're a huge baseball fan. You do it for a job, but do you watch any other sports during either the off season or during the baseball season? Do you even have time to do that?
Yeah, I mean, time to do it now with what I do with baseball, maybe a little less so, not in the current climate, but normally.
Right.
But yeah, in my previous job with ESPN, I had to research everything, you know, and that was the job. I researched the 11 p.m. Sports Center a lot. So certainly you have to be paying attention to everything. But baseball has always been my favorite sport. It was probably my first sport. But yeah, I mean, I watched pretty much everything. So
you mentioned that you attended U Chicago. Did you study like journalism or writing related field, or was it something else?
It was actually something else. So University of Chicago does not have a journalism major.
Oh.
I think it was the only school that I applied to where that was true. But I didn't really mind because I knew exactly what I wanted to do regardless. But I majored in basically psychology. It was
Interesting.
a couple other things too, but it was basically psychology. And you know, I got to practice my writing all the time because you're writing research papers, which is actually maybe a little closer to reporting in certain ways than an English major would be. And yeah, and you know, I was the editor of the school paper, the sports section, and I did you know, a bunch of interviews with our student athletes and that kind of stuff. So I sort of kept that focus even though I wasn't majoring in journalism.
So have you ever found yourself applying things that you learned in college, specifically in like psychology, to what you do now, which obviously doesn't have much to do with psychology? Like, are there skills that you picked up that you find yourself that, like, I guess going back, like, there are a couple questions I'd ask. So that one, and then also if you were to look back in hindsight, knowing what you do now, would you focus less on psychology, more on journalism? But you did say that psychology was something that, or you knew what you wanted to do going to college, and it didn't matter that there wasn't journalism. That was kind of a long question.
I mean, to answer the second part first, I honestly don't think I would do it any differently because I think I got a really good blend of actual like academia and what I wanted there, and then also with internships and, you know, school paper and jobs and things like that I had still working on the actual sports journalism side of it. And I think that ultimately that served me really well and helped make me maybe a more well-rounded person as well. And in terms of how I use the major, I mean, I evaluate people all the time. And I think that, you know, there's a lot of subtle things you learn in psychology when you learn different theories and how people interact with each other that helps you every day. I mean, and that would be true no matter what job I had taken, but certainly with the idea of how people treat each other and how people interact. I certainly take a lot away from that.
Gotcha. So I usually save this question to the end of the interviews. I ask every person that's come on this so far, but since we're talking about school right now, I always ask each guest I have what their favorite class was specifically, like either in high school or college or before then, if you really enjoyed a class, because a lot of people I've talked to either work in like the reporting, commentating, or they work in like the number side of things. But I don't think I've actually talked to anyone that actually that their favorite class was something related to numbers, which is kind of funny for a big group of people who are interested in math and statistics in general. Like a lot of them didn't study math, and a lot of them had favorite classes other than that. So what would that be for you?
Yeah, so it definitely wouldn't be a math class for me. I loved math in high school, but in college I took a stats class, and it was my only math class in college. It wasn't necessarily notable, but it did help. It does help every day. But my favorite class was a history class I took my freshman year called Baseball and American History. And
that sounds like a good class.
Yeah. So it was about baseball, but the point was tracing, you know, the storylines of American history and how they've related to baseball throughout the years. It started in like the 1840s, I want to say, and just went all the way up to the present. And was an outstanding professor, and I learned partway into the class that it was like a class that was reserved for seniors, and I don't really know how I got in. I think it was like a mistake in the computer system. So I was the only freshman in the class, which was also a really good experience, just trying to keep up with the seniors when I'd been there it was my spring quarter, so I'd only been there a handful of months. But I really loved that, and it was a wonderful professor who I still, email occasionally. He's a Red Sox fan, so if there's anything about the Red Sox, I pass it along his way. And he's a huge baseball fan, but it was really about, race relations in the United States and a lot of other things, that the way that they've intertwined with baseball throughout the years.
That sounds really interesting. So at U Chicago, I think, if my Chicago geography is correct, I live in the suburbs, not in the city, but U Chicago is closer to the south side than the north side. Is that correct?
Yeah, it's on the south side. Yeah,
okay, that's what I thought. So did you find yourself going to like a lot of White Sox games while you were a student there?
I think it was pretty split. The White Sox are really close. They're 2 stops away on the red line, which is really convenient. But it sort of just depended on when I had time and who was home,
Yeah.
The White Sox, my senior year, I had a car in college. So the White Sox had a really good family Sunday deal or something where parking was like $2. So we went to a lot of those senior year. But prior to that, it was pretty much all over the place. But it was really cool because I got to see Chris Sale a bunch. The time when I was in college was when he was still on the White Sox. And I wanted the Cubs to be good just for the energy at the time I was in school. But I missed them by about a year. So, yeah.
So, growing up a Mets fan, you said, who were some of your favorite players? Like, who were some of the players that you found yourself rooting for the most when you were a kid?
Yeah, so my first favorite player was Mike Piazza, which isn't a necessarily atypical answer for someone who grew up a Mets fan. But my first Mets game was his first game as a Met, May 23rd, 1998.
Wow.
So, I remember my parents telling me, hey, there's this new guy. He's really important. He's going to be really good. And I sort of just, latched onto that energy right from the get-go. So he was certainly my first favorite player. But, I was a Mets fan in the late 90s and early 2000s. There was Benny Agbayani and there was Edgardo Alfonso. And, there were definitely some fun guys. I was a huge Shinjo fan. He wore number 5 before David Wright, and then when David Wright came around and all of that I was getting older, so I wasn't necessarily, a huge like, oh my gosh, this is my favorite player in quite the same way. But they were a fun team to root for when I was younger.
So it might have been the Piazza game for you, but if it wasn't, what's your favorite memory as a baseball fan or as a sports fan in general, whether it was when you were younger or since you've graduated college or whatever?
Honestly, my favorite memory doesn't have to do with the Mets. It doesn't have to do with the team that I used to root for. It has to do with the Giants. So when they won the World Series in 2010, I was still in high school. I was living at home, and I remember sitting with my mom watching the final game of that World Series when they would go on to win. And I just remember when they won, we jumped up and down and were hugging each other. And like, I'd never had a team that I had rooted for or even rooted for, like for my mother or anything like that, ever win anything. So I didn't even know what to do. And it was just this like euphoria of, I was so excited for her. And, luckily in 2012 and 2014, I got to be super excited for her again. And I would also be really nervous because I didn't want her team to lose. Like that would be so devastating for me because I didn't want her to be upset. But I think that night that they won the 2010 World Series is probably what sticks out.
So how about currently, like who are some of your favorite players that you find yourself rooting for? For me, it's like Matt Chapman, Mike Trout, Shohei Ohtani are like my 3 favorite players that aren't on the Cubs. Who do you find yourself rooting for like the most? Whether it's for like having a cool stat or something like that, or just because you enjoy watching them?
I mean, I love watching Trout, but that's an easy answer. But I think that beyond that, I don't know. I tend to gravitate towards pitching. I was a huge Chris Sale fan in college and even more so recently. Obviously, unfortunate to see the Tommy John surgery. But I mean, Jacob deGrom and Noah Syndergaard, Max Scherzer. I'm a huge Max Scherzer fan. I love, seeing what he does. I love the way he pitches. And I think that ultimately for me, it tends to come back to pitchers. So all of these power pitchers we've got, I mean, I love watching Garrett Cole. I'm so excited whenever baseball does start again. I'm so excited that he's, now right here in my market that I'll get to see him pitch a whole lot. Yeah.
So obviously baseball is not happening right now and probably won't happen in the near future. But do you see? Obviously, you're not someone that studies diseases for a living, so you probably don't have an educated answer on this. But if you had to guess, based on what you know, whether it's been sports wise or just what you've been reading in the news, obviously this is not an educated decision whatsoever. But if you had to guess when baseball's coming back, do you see coming back this year? If so, like at what point, or do you think it's going to be on off until next year?
Honestly, I don't feel qualified to answer that.
Yeah,
I don't know. I research numbers, but I just, I'm so grateful to all the healthcare workers and everybody who are working to keep us safe. And, I trust that it won't happen until everybody can remain safe. And, that makes me glad to hear for the good of the sport, for the good of the fans and everybody else.
Yeah, definitely. Well, Sarah, I think we've pretty much covered everything that I wanted to ask you. Is there anything that you have that you wish that I asked you during this?
Oh, that's so funny. I used to do college interviews. Like when I was in college, I would interview high school students applying to college, and that was always my last question. Like,
okay.
You wanted me to ask? But I don't know if I have an answer to it.
Gotcha.
No, but thank you so much for having me. It's great to chat, and hopefully we'll be watching some games again sometime soon.
Yeah, I really appreciate you coming on. Most of all, I hope you stay safe. I know it's really bad in New York right now, so definitely, I'm sure you're being responsible, but to everyone listening, stay inside, protect other people, don't be selfish, and yeah, everyone stay safe. Sarah, thank you so much for coming on. I really appreciate it.
Thank you so much. Stay safe.